In this video, I'm going to show you how to calibrate your E-steps or rotational distance on your 3D printer using a Sonic pad running Clipper firmware. This is the second video of my intermediate Sonic pad series where I show you how to tune your 3D printer and Sonic pad combination for the best quality and speed. Calibrating your extruder is important because it's what controls how much filament is extruded at any time while you're printing. If it's calibrated incorrectly, then you'll get under or over extrusion, or in other words, you'll have too little or too much filament passing through your nozzle and onto your print. Changing your rotational distance is simply a case of editing one parameter on your Sonic pad. However, working out what that figure needs to be is not that obvious, which is why I'm going to run you through how to do it. First, let's see if we even need to change anything. To do this, we're going to tell the printer to extrude a set amount of filament and then see if it does what it's told. There are two slightly different methods for measuring how much filament is extruded depending on what type of 3D printer you have. You may have a direct drive 3D printer like this Ender 3 S1 Pro where the extruder is located on the X-axis carriage, or you might have a remote extruder connected to your hot end via a Bowden tube. With a direct drive extruder, measure and mark your filament at the top where it enters the extruder. We'll be extruding 100mm, so put a mark at 100mm and at 120mm from the top of the extruder. On a Bowden tube printer, you can use the same method, but instead measuring from where the filament enters the extruder on the side. Or the method that I prefer is to remove the coupling on the other side of the extruder and cut the filament off flush. This way you can cut the filament again when it's finished extruding and measure the piece of filament that has come out. Use whichever method you prefer. To tell our 3D printer to extrude the amount of filament we want, we're not going to use the extrude button on the extrusions page. This is because it would extrude at too high a speed and cause a pressure build-up behind the nozzle, which will skew our results. If you've removed your Bowden tube, then technically you could use this, but it's not the method that I prefer. What we're going to do instead is send very specific commands so that it does exactly what we want it to. To do this, we're going to need access to the console, either on our Sonic pad or via the web UI that I showed you how to access in the Basics series. On the Sonic pad, navigate to the Configure page, select Other Settings and then Advanced Options. At the top, you'll see an option to turn on the console. Once you've done this, the console will be selectable from the Control page. Before we leave the Advanced Options page, scroll all the way to the bottom and open Extrusion Configurations. Make a note of the figure displayed next to Extrusion Rotational Distance. This will be our previous rotational distance figure. Now return to the main screen. Before we can extrude any filament, we need to heat our hot end to over 180 degrees. This is because there's a safety feature built in to stop you trying to force filament through a cold hot end. Heat the nozzle using the preheating page. If you're going to have filament passing through your nozzle during this test, then the higher the temperature, the less resistance there'll be, which is a good thing. For PLA, I use over 220 degrees. Once your hot end is up to temperature and you've made any marks you need to on your filament, then type the following commands into the console. Start with M83 and click Send. This puts the extruder into relative mode. Then type G1, E100, F100. The E100 tells it to extrude what it believes is 100mm, and the F100 tells it to do it at a speed of 100mm per minute. When you hit Send, your extruder will try to push through 100mm of filament. Once it's done, either measure to your marks or cut and measure your filament to see how much filament was actually extruded during the test. I would do this 3 times and then take an average of the figures you get. Make a note of this as your actual extrude distance. If your actual extrude distance is 100mm or within a millimeter, then you don't need to change anything as your rotational distance is perfect. Instead, you can now move straight on to the next video in the Sonic pad series where I show you how to set up your slicer settings to maximize your Sonic pad setup. If, however, you had a figure that was more than a millimeter from the 100mm target, then I'll now show you how to put it right. What we're going to do is take your actual extrude distance and your current rotational distance and calculate what your new rotational distance should be. I'll use my figures as an example. The average of my actual extrude distance was 104mm, and my previous rotational distance was 32.473. Divide your actual extrude distance by your requested extrude distance, which, if you followed my advice, will be 100mm. For me, that means typing 104 divided by 100, which gives me 1.04. Then multiply this result by your previous rotational distance. For me, this is 1.04 multiplied by 32.473. which equals 33.772 to 3 decimal places. Do this calculation with your figures and see what results you get. I get a lot of comments on my other E-Steps videos where people often get this calculation wrong. If the amount of filament that your printer actually extruded was bigger than the 100mm, or it over extruded, then your new rotational distance will need to be bigger than your previous rotational distance. If your printer extruded less than 100mm, then your new rotational distance will need to be smaller than your previous rotational distance. If this isn't the case with your calculation, then skip back and just make sure you're doing things in the correct order. Once you're happy with your result, then navigate back to the extrusion configurations page on your Sonic Pad and overtype the extrusion rotational distance with your new figure and hit save. Your Sonic Pad will reboot to save the figures. Reheat your hot end, open the console, and then repeat the M83 and then G1, E100, F100 commands to see how much your printer now extrudes. You should now find that your extruded amount is much closer, if not exactly 100mm. When you're done, enter M82 and click send, which puts your printer back into absolute positioning mode. You can repeat this process if you're not 100% satisfied with the result, but once you are happy, it's time to move on to look at your slicer settings to start increasing your print speeds. Click here to go to that video now. I'll see you there.